Hi, welcome back. I hope that everyone got a refreshing break. I'm Matthew Villar Miranda. I'm a curatorial fellow in visual arts here. I was trying to get through this written introduction, but I just had too much. I think Stephanie Sahuko in an earlier conversation was like, I'm really nervous, but it's just going to be a big love fest, so it won't be that bad. And so I think I'm just going to try to concentrate on that love fest energy to introduce Vicky. But I just am really happy to, the party was amazing last night. There was like over 900 people. If that was accurate, that's insane. And everybody came out like 1,100? Oh my gosh, that's more than I thought. But everyone turned up and turned out for it. And it's also so like beautiful to hear so much Tagalog like in the museum. So I was just so excited about this show because I was like, the Walker, this beacon of conceptualism, are gonna throw rickrack ribbons and buttons and sequins and glitter on the walls. And I was like, who fought for this? And it was Vicky. So I want to thank the funders for also making this exhibition happen, Martha and Bruce Atwater, Ford Foundation, Henry Luce Foundation, Rosemary and Kevin McNeely, and the Manitou Fund, Jennifer Martin and Brown Foundation, Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts. Additional support was provided by James Anderson and the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, Robert and Rebecca Polat, Annette and John Whaley, and the catalog was supported by Tina Kim Gallery, Silver Lens Gallery, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And we also want to thank our media partner, the Minneapolis St. Paul Magazine. I know we did a land acknowledgement already, but I just thought that another one is always needed, and especially around Pacita's work, who is an artist who is not only joyous and joyful, but her work is really sharp and critical and is an opportunity to think deeply about place and challenge histories of settler colonialism. And especially within the Filipina community, museum spaces are hard for me and us because we oftentimes didn't work here. We were kind of collected and placed here as like ethnographic specimens or anthropological finds or war photographs. And so artists like Stephanie Sahuko, who was one of my first artists that I studied in college, were doing things like taking carceral photographs of Billy Beat Prison and erasing the subject out of them. So we don't have to be subjected to that gaze again. And thank you, Anji Ju, for moderating that panel. And then I have a surprise for Angel, which is that I was such a nerd about Angel that I found a signed copy of Vestiges of War, but it wasn't signed to me because it was signed in 2006. And that was 17 years ago, but this book was my awakening. It was the first time I read Renato Constantino. It was like Miseducation of the Filipino. It was the first time I came across Doreen Fernandez's food, decolonial histories, and it was part of my awakening. And I'm just like ecstatic that I got to be witnessing a conversation with you all. And so I think about a land acknowledgement is that museums and through your practices and through Pacita's practices, they're not just places of capture or exhibition, they're places where you can really clap back. And Pacita did clap back. So Vicky is the Phyllis C. Wattis Senior Curator at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, also Associate Curator at Walker. And some of my favorite exhibitions have come through her, which is Pao Houa Her, Shen Xin, Rayyane Tabet, who's here with us, Theaster Gates, Siah Armajani. But I think what's really important was that she was so rigorous, and I'm coining this term, so heart forward. It was so hard to get some of these really important works like Marcos and his cronies and 100 Years of Freedom because the institutions that have them and the places where they come from, they didn't really want to let them go. They're historical and monumental. And I just really saw Vicky's determinism and academic rigor and really real commitment to an artist practice. And that's just, that's Vicky's. I thank you. I'll always be grateful for you for that. And Vicky's going to introduce Pacita Abad and Shabbir Hussain Mustafa.
Matt, and before you run off, I just want to say a special thank you to Matthew because he was an invaluable partner throughout this entire exhibition, and he was here on the ground sorting out all the details of everything that you see on the walls. So this exhibition really would have not been possible without Matt here. But I also want to say he was such a critical thought partner to me, and his many contributions to the exhibition, to the catalog, it's reflected, both in the walls and on our pages in the catalog. So just a huge thanks to Matt for your, really heartfelt and incisive contributions. So please help me in thanking Matt. All right, well, welcome to all of you again. Thank you for staying with us for panel 2, and it is my pleasure to be able to introduce the 2 speakers we have with me on stage. So to my left is Pao Abad, who is an artist whose work is concerned with the personal and political entanglement of objects. Deeply informed by unfolding events in the Philippines, where he was born and raised, Pao's work emanates from a family narrative woven into the nation's story. He has exhibited extensively at the 58th Carnegie International, the 5th Kochi Biennial, Ateneo Art Gallery in Manila, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Tokyo, 2nd Honolulu Biennial, 12th Gwangju Biennial, among many, many other institutions. But Pao is here today with us as the curator of the Pacita Abad Art Estate, where he works alongside Jack and Christy Garrity to preserve the artist's legacy. And it really is thanks to Pao and Joselina Cruz from the Museum of Contemporary Art and Design in Manila that really kind of set off a resurgence or a global recognition of Pacita's practice with the solo show they organized there in 2018. And next to Pao is Shabbir Hussain Mustafa. And Matt mentioned that there were a couple works that were very, difficult to get to the exhibition here in the US. Both of them come from Singapore, and it's really thanks to Mustafa that we were able to bring these works here. But he is a curator who is interested in curating as storytelling. He explores narratives by engaging with artists and thinkers, often creating spaces of temporal frictions in which the act of recollection becomes a vector for imagined futures. Mustafa is senior curator at the Singapore Art Museum and the National Gallery of Singapore, where he builds links between the art of Southeast Asia and the world. And so I'm so thrilled to have the 2 of you here with me because both of you were so formative in terms of my own thinking about Pacita and this exhibition. But before we jump in here, I also just want to again thank panel 1 because Unji, Stephanie, and Angel contributed so much to this project as well. And so if you look at the catalog, the Pacita Abad catalog, both Stephanie and Angel participated in the oral history very generously. And I just need to read a couple of their quotes because they really were so helpful for me. So I'm just going to start with one of Stephanie's quotes, but you have to read the whole oral history when you get the book. But Stephanie, asked, she said, "Why didn't Pacita get the recognition? We're so late in the game of recognition. Pacita was doing all the things that other artists were doing, yet, she wasn't learning about Pacita when she was in art school." And Angel, too, she talks about Pacita so poetically, and I absolutely loved when she observed how Pacita inhaled other cultures, is the word that she used. She says, Pacita inhaled other cultures and stitched them together consciously, unconsciously, intuitively in the making of her works. So I feel like those are both just 2 incredible framings for Pacita. And then I have to say, Unji was such an important thought partner. And of course, she is organizing the exhibition when it travels to SF MoMA. So we're so grateful to be collaborating together. But Unji really helped me also think about Pacita as, you saw in panel 1, really kind of breaking out of the framework of putting her in this context of being an outsider artist or a self-taught artist. And very early on, she said, you really have to get ahead of that. So it was a very important conversation to me. So I just want to thank all three panelists. And for me, it was so special to see the three of you in conversation. So, I think the first panel talked about this or touched on this as well. And as we were discussing, what we should talk about, we were like, how do we even approach Pacita? And that's in some ways a guiding question, I think, for us. How do we approach Pacita? Because, and I think Pio and Moose are two incredible people to talk about this because you've done it in different ways. And of course, Pio, with family histories and oral histories, and Mustafa with building kind of these larger narratives around Southeast Asian histories and art histories. Let's just start there. And Pio, I want to ask you kind of, maybe you can help us ground Pacita as an artist and a person.
Well, I think, first of all, I think I just wanted to share that, for the past few days, I've been in this state of like ecstatic exhaustion, because this celebration of Pacita has felt like a family wedding, a graduation, and a retrospective all at once. And I've had the amazing opportunity to talk about Pacita's work in multiple cities and in different contexts, but never with the full force of the Abads and Garrities staring at me as the crow flies. So I know this is the hardest audience I'll get. But I think, in beginning to think about Pacita, it's really family that grounds her. And in beginning to think about family, like, there's a quote that I've used too many times when thinking about her work and my practice in relation to her work as well. It's a John le Carré quote where he says, he's had the great fortune of being born with a subject matter. And I think with Pacita, it's really that, it's family. And family isn't, the story of the family is rooted in a very specific place, an island called Batanes, which in a way that's what kind of gives Pacita this incredible sense of mythology, but also an incredible sense of rootedness. Because I'm sure many of you aren't aware, Batanes, I think as is written in the exhibition text, is the northernmost island of the Philippines. But in many ways, it doesn't share any characteristics with the rest of the Philippine islands. It's more in tune with a Scottish island than a tropical island in Southeast Asia. And that remoteness also, it's closer to Taiwan than it is to Manila, the capital city. And I think when Pacita was growing up, it would take a week on a boat or like I think something like a 12-hour bus ride in a very hairy plane just to get to the capital. And I think when she was growing up, the highlight of the week was when the plane would land in Batanes and the entire island would go from wherever they were just to watch it land and watch people get off the plane. But I think that sense of remoteness also gave Pacita and gave Pacita's siblings an incredible sense of rootedness, an incredible sense of place. And I think that fortitude that made her keep going when there wasn't really an audience for her work, that self-belief that, she was sharing something important to various publics, various communities, really came from the sense of rootedness of that remoteness. Pacita was also one of 12 siblings, and I think as you said in my bio, like my work is rooted in a family story that's entwined with the national story, because through Pacita's siblings you really get the various experiences of not just the history of the Philippines, but in a way the history of the world. Like, so Pacita was supposed to be the politician, but then circumstances led to her becoming an artist. We'll go to that later, but it ended up being my dad who took on that role of being involved in anti-dictatorial, in the anti-dictatorship struggle, and the challenges of rebuilding the country after Marcos, the first Marcos. I can't believe we have to say this now. The first Marcos regime, decimated it. My Aunt Vicky worked in the refugee camps in the Thai-Cambodian border before moving to France. But that experience of working with the destitute and working with, being really embedded in the lives of refugees, that comes from a family narrative. My Aunt Martina ended up working as a nurse in DC, New Jersey, and then the Bronx. And so there's that history of labor and migration that's embedded in it. And Renzi obviously was instrumental in Pacita realizing her, epic trapuntos. So the siblings are really, the story of the Philippines is refracted through the lives of Pacita's siblings and of the family. And I think, thinking through how Pacita ended up in, where she ended here, really, she was supposed to be the politician in the family, and she was actually about to study law in Madrid. And I think the decision to leave the Philippines was a product of different circumstances, but mainly because her activism found her in the crosshairs of the brutal Marcos regime. But when she left the Philippines, there was no indication that she was going to be an artist. She was going to go to Madrid, study law, and maybe come back later on and be the first female congresswoman in Batanes. I don't know. But something happened. The flight to Madrid had a layover in San Francisco. And just by coincidence, it was the summer of love. And so Pacita ends up in San Francisco in 1969, 1970. I need to check my years because Jack is looking at me. And this incredible transformation from a law student to this romantic bohemian artist, starts taking place. And we'll go there. That's the beginning, I think.
Yes, great start. Pio, I want to ask you to expand a little bit more maybe on kind of, your family's political involvement and then Pacita's, own engagement with politics as a student activist. And then I might try to bring in Mustafa a little bit there too.
Well, I think for the family, the dictatorship was a formative moment, was also a destructive moment, was an earth-shattering moment. But my grandfather was part of the political opposition at the time as Marcos. He hadn't declared martial law yet, but it was clear that the country was going into an authoritarian regime, and I think there was a fraudulent elections that happened in the late 60s, and I think there was this cataclysmic event where Marcos's goons actually went to the family home and sprayed the family home with machine gun bullets. And I think that was the moment. And I think at the time, Pacita was organizing student demonstrations against the fraudulent elections. There was even a moment where she was able to meet Marcos in Malacanang Palace alongside other student activists. And because she had such an active role in this movement, I think it became clear that she needed to leave the country. And so that's what led to this journey that led to her becoming this incredible artist.
Yeah, and I think, the intertwining of the family histories, national histories, as you mentioned, is really important to think about. And Moose, I know you've done quite a lot of work on this, in this period of the 60s to the 80s in the Philippines, as well as other parts of Southeast Asia. And we have here actually this wonderful book that Moose has edited. It's called Suddenly Turning Visible: Art and Architecture in Southeast Asia, 1969 to 1989. And one part of it really focuses on the cultural center of the Philippines as this kind of, architectural monument and what that means. And I wonder if you can kind of help, maybe expand the conversation a little bit to talk about first maybe that moment and how artists and architects maybe were responding in their different art forms, and then we can turn it back to Pacita.
Thank you, and thank you both of you for having me here. Thank you to Yeye for getting me involved in the early days, who has just arrived, as always. Jack, for all the stories over the years, just kind of sitting down and just telling stories, and that's been great. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that at some point as well. But Vicky, going back to your question, I think this moment in the late 60s, at least as far as the surveying of artistic production or cultural thinking is concerned, is quite pivotal, because on the one hand there is the Summer of Love, but there's also the Vietnam War, and it's really creating sensations and vibrations through the region, as we call it, Southeast Asia. And I always like to think of the region as having two faces at the time. On the one hand, Southeast Asia is nearly insurgent, whereas in Europe, for example, maybe there is a kind of a cultural rebellion happening. But this insurgency in Southeast Asia is also generating all these kind of I suppose, manifestations within the aesthetic realm. And this aesthetic realm stops becoming exclusive as a space. And what I mean by this is that you have artists, you have architects, you have poets, you have dreamers, you have thinkers, everybody kind of getting in on it, and suddenly realizing that all the promises that the post-colonial nation had made in the 40s and the 50s had not materialized. And now, suddenly, around them was a kind of a sensation of authoritarianism that began to grow. And the tools that they had at their disposal were somehow limited as well. And artists had basically two kind of options. Stay and think, leave and think as well. There was no other option there. And essentially, Pacita, I feel, as I begin to kind of understand her work and place her within this larger kind of a rubric of a region which is extremely diverse, I suddenly realized that the more I thought she stood outside of these lenses, the more she was a part of it. And so in a sense, I think this kind of internal contradiction makes her this kind of marvelous figure to think about and work with. And I have a kind of anecdote, actually. When Pio and Yeye invited me to contribute to the monograph, initially they wanted me to write an essay. And actually, I did write an essay. I just never sent it to you guys. It was on on Marcos and his cronies, because I can actually break down the imagery, because it's based on a certain ritual that happens in the southern coast of Sri Lanka called Da Tuveni Sanya, which is like the 18th stanza or the 18th expression, which is essentially a dance of exorcism, where the afflicted is brought in and then somehow told that the tools of your recovery lie within you, right? And that you will recover yourself. There is no external force that is kind of making you this being that you have become or that you are. And I thought that was incredibly potent and poetic to think about the Philippines, which was kind of an ocean away. And I'll just give maybe perhaps one anecdote. So in the book that you mentioned, I will apologize to Jack about it, because the painting Fly to Freedom, which is now in the collection of the National Gallery, is actually represented with a black and white image, because we discovered the painting and then Jack said, yes, you can have it, but it was on the way and we had not actually photographed it and the catalog had to go to print. And in a sense, I only share this not as a highlight of my curatorial incompetence of getting things sorted on time, but more as a kind of a way of thinking through urgency and working through urgency and also working through contingency. So much so that we were surveying not just what was happening at the CCP, but also at the Birasri Institute of Modern Art in Bangkok and the Alpha Gallery in Singapore. And so these three sites emerged in response to the very kind of cultural questions that I mentioned. And incredibly, Pacita was connected to all three of them. In fact, the painting Fly to Freedom was made by, and I use these in quotes because we were also warned in the previous panel about labels and how they become easily kind of manipulated. But here was a kind of a Filipino artist painting Cambodian subject matter, but then presenting it in Thailand, right? And there is no Philippines in that in terms of the representation. And I found that quite intriguing as a prospect, because you have someone who is, in a sense, reflecting on national conditions, but also quietly escaping them and exceeding them. And in a sense, I just want to make a quick point about art history and my gripes with the discipline. I try to think discipline has a flip side. No, it's also discipline. Yeah. So you must remember that. Is that in a sense this is where it limits itself, and this is where figures like Pacita, I believe, exceed it. And I think, in a sense, I always joke with Pio, like we should just stay with the trouble, right? And never kind of leave it behind, because then that's what makes museums interesting places, I guess.
I think that's the amazing thing. When you really look at Pacita's exhibition history, there's always this need to kind of rejig coordinates and to sort of subvert expectations. You know, when you think about Pacita's first show so I'm really not used to holding a mic. When you think about Pacita's first exhibition in Manila, you know, it was about street scenes in Bangladesh. When you think about Pacita's first exhibition in Bangkok, it was portraits of people from Sudan. So there was always this need to expand the worldview in a way that was unexpected, but was also surprisingly intimate. And that's the same with Marcos and his cronies, because the idea of reimagining the Philippine dictator as a Sri Lankan mythological demon is radical. But then I was looking at that painting, in May when Bongbong Marcos was assuming the presidency. And the Sri Lankan kleptocracy was collapsing. So you had it becomes incredibly contemporary in a way that she wouldn't have envisioned, but she had that foresight to kind of constantly remap the world, because I think for her, her practice was at the center of the world. And so whatever was tangential to her, it could have been New York, it could have been London, she always existed in these peripheries, but they were never peripheral. There were always coordinates to be reimagined. And just one more anecdote about Marcos and his cronies, because Ferdinand Marcos is known as, he's not a very tall figure. So I think Jack told me this story that one of the reasons that is the composition of the painting was that apparently Marcos arrives in hell and he's looking really tall. And they were like, Ferdy, you're looking really tall. And, and he goes, of course, I'm standing on the shoulders of Imelda.
So if you look at that work, which is hanging in our public space right now above the stairwell, Imelda, which is the masked figure on the very bottom, is heavily bejeweled. and quite different from the other ones. But she's, wearing earrings, has rhinestones even between her teeth. The gums are, these like pink beads. So it's fascinating how Pacita kind of took that into the actual making. I think, just listening to both of you talk about Pacita and from different perspectives, it's very clear that Mustafa, as you're saying too, it's kind of like art history cannot, or at least our art historical frameworks cannot really unpack Pacita. Like she kind of explodes, how we're used to writing or thinking about art histories. And so I want to maybe dig in a little bit more with each of you for how you kind of approach her, because both of you have done that, in your own work. And, Moose, you in particular, when I, visited Singapore, and you took me through, the collection galleries at the National Gallery of Singapore, and there in those galleries, you're really creating and crafting these histories. And they're not linear histories, right? When we think about kind of an art history or situating Pacita in art histories, it's really difficult because, as both of you touched on, she's not someone who existed in a single context, right? She moved so fluidly between American, art histories, Philippine art histories, other global diasporic art histories. And so again, I'm kind of throwing the question out and we're going to continuously kind of circle around this, like, how do we wrap our heads around her? And, when we were talking to Jack the other day, I mean, I love once Jack said to me, he was like, when you try to grapple with Pacita, it's kind of like tangling with an octopus. And it's so true, because she was so multifaceted, not just in terms of her making, her materiality, her mediums that she transcended, but the context in which she worked. So I kind of want to, maybe throw it back to you both again, like how do we get closer and closer to, understanding an artist like Pacita?
I mean, I think I can only speak from my experience, and for me, it's been this like constant choreography between distance and intimacy. Because I've spent a number of years trying to situate her art historically, but at the same time, she was my aunt. And she was a very real figure. In fact, yesterday I was just going through my Yahoo email and just looking through our correspondence, before she died, because I left for Glasgow in September 2004. I think she was the one who kind of encouraged me to leave Manila, and she passed away December 2004. So just revisiting those emails was really interesting, but it's also like, it's this constant need to sort of place her art historically, but then also recognize that she is genetically imprinted on me, and that's been a really productive space to constantly think about her. And to make sure she's constantly present. Like when I started organizing the shows, we didn't quite do it at MCAD, but at Spike Island in Bristol and in Art Jamil in Dubai, I think we really made it a point to show this incredible film, which has been remastered for the show by Kaveri Call, where it's Pacita, speaking about her practice as she was preparing for the Metro art installation in DC, and to just have her voice and her love for jazz and blues kind of infect the spaces was really important, because as much as she is now clearly becoming a major art historical figure, she was, we called her Auntie Fabulous, because that was her favorite adjective, which she used freely. And you'd often hear that as a cackle before you saw her. And so to have both of these sides of her present constantly, has been a challenge, but also has been the greatest motivator of this project.
I was kind of thanks, Pio, for going first, because it gave me a little bit of time to articulate my response. I want to finish the story I started off with. So after I didn't send Yeye and Pio the essay, which I will still not send you, so don't bother asking. It will forever stay on my hard drive. But I think that's when I proposed to the two of them that we do a conversation. The proposition to do a conversation was not to kind of get out of more kind of formal ways of writing, not at all. I think the proposition was to try and find a way to center orality and oral frictions within the kind of space for thinking about artists such as Pacita, right? And in a sense, I felt like if I was to write an essay, I would never be able to fully capture all these complexities which a conversation potentially could aspire to, not really get there, but really just aspire to. And so to try to stay with oral or orality as a medium. And I say this because one strategy that I have personally devised over the years is to work with ethnography or the ethnographic as a kind of a technology and a tool, but to not go so far as for this ethnography to become anthropology, because when you go that far, anthropology, again, as a discipline, is embedded within colonial kind of conventions of how the other was imagined and thought of and represented, right? So, this is how those people behave, and I'm going to write about it, and then we're all going to sit down in a university and then kind of pontificate about it. And that's where the problematic is. So to try and use ethnography as a technology, as a tool, in order to kind of bring in fragments, memories, or memorats, as I call it, memorats in the sense where how communities would kind of essentially remember individuals or groups so as to make them important again, so to speak. So to try and reinstate these stories. And so for me, the catalog here, I was totally amazed that there is an entire section just dedicated to what is quite literally called oral histories. And so in a sense, I think even when I look at that book and I haven't read through it, obviously I just kind of flipped through it, I recognize that these questions around canonical formations in museums today can be made contingent. They can be made, and the exhibition can become a site to include and to do away with past exclusions, but not to the extent where you are trying to rebuke everything that has come prior to it. Because if you rebuke everything, then you're literally left with very little actually to hold on to, and you kind of fall through. And to try and be careful about this and do it with a lot of caution as well. So in a sense, I think, Vicky, congratulations to you, because I think here is a case study. And I hope in the years to come, and I've spoken to Pio about this as well, in terms of the aesthetics of care, right? And Jack kind of fits into this narrative too, is how do we actually take care of an estate? Who is the gatekeeper? What is the function of the gatekeeper? I know the gatekeeper sounds rather negative, but perhaps there could be a productive space. So as the gatekeeper is actually a figure who keeps the debate open and does not enable closure, because the moment you aim for closure, you can see the horizon, and then it's too late, I think. So to try and still build a canon, so-called, but not an alternative one, but just completely different. Yeah, something that is built on a new set of principles almost entirely.
I think the way I've seen my role with the estate, for the past 6 years now, has always been, it's always been finding ways to maintain Pacita's complexity, because there's so many works that could actually be pigeonholed into certain, I think a very cynical way of presenting LA Liberty actually could go somewhere else that Pacita wouldn't have intended, but that constant need to maintain her complexity, her contradictions, And actually sometimes, the fact that stories don't match up, these are important things to retain. And a huge part of this has been building the scholarship around Pacita. And I really want to thank Vicky and the entire team here at the Walker for putting together this, Old and New Testament level, size. Because the first book we produced is called like A Million Things to Say. This is like, I have 23 million trillion things to say. But maybe Vicky, talk about the process of inviting the writers, but also how the oral history was initially conceptualized.
Yeah, I mean, I love, and Moose, just to follow on what you were saying about the importance of orality. And I think oral history as a strategy is something really, interesting to think more and more about in terms of how we engage with artists and artist legacies. But I think for, someone like Pacita, working on this exhibition too, changed how I think about working with artists, because I think, generally when we, think about artists, we try to think about how do we maybe insert them into an existing canon, right? That's the easiest way, right? We think about, well, who was this artist in conversation with? Who were they responding to? That's kind of, one kind of strategy. And with someone like Pacita, she really wasn't in, any single milieu, right? Like she wasn't in sustained conversation with any group of artists. She kind of dipped in and out of different art worlds, but she also wasn't in, an art world as we think of it today. She was really engaging with, so many artists and makers, but maybe not artists and makers that we may necessarily recognize or have been recognized. And so in some ways that was a real challenge, right? In trying to put together a retrospective. And it's also in some ways an introduction for many people to her practice. And, to say this artist is really important, but then how do we say she is important? And I think for someone like Pacita, who also may have had kind of a narrative that was in some ways a singular narrative, there's like a mythology right around her and in a family kind of mythology around her. I thought it was so important just to bring in a ton of voices, and a ton of voices who, as you're saying, like may not necessarily be in art books generally. Right. So, of course, we talked to other artists and curators who knew Pacita, but we also talked to family members and friends. And that polyphony of voices really helped shape our understanding of Pacita. And so the oral history for me was one of the most rewarding projects that, Pio and I did together, and talking to, so many of Pacita's siblings. That was just critical to our understanding of how she, lived in the world both as a person and an artist. But I think, just going back quickly to, there's a notion of course, like oral history as a strategy. But another way that Pacita really challenged me too was, in museums we tend to be kind of quite strict about, artworks, right? Putting artworks on the wall. But Pacita was an artist who made no distinction between what was an art object and what was not an art object. Everything for her, basically every surface was up for grabs in terms of her pattern, her paint, her decoration. And so even in our exhibition galleries, it was interesting because we have, in our galleries, a lot of what might be called material culture. And so I think material culture is another strategy maybe for approaching, artists like Pacita who may not strictly fit into, the quote unquote art historical canon.
Can I just say something very quickly about this? And I know, it's important you mentioned about looking at who Pacita was connected to artistically. And there are a number of figures whom we have kind of uncovered over the years. But there's one particular figure that I want to speak about is the Bangladeshi artist Zainul Abidin. And Zainul Abidin, of course, much senior to her, whom she met in Bangladesh, and had devised an incredible technique. And this was a kind of a conscious aesthetic technique where he was working what we call kind of, like high aesthetics, right, of painting, where the painter sits in the studio and then the patron arrives and then acquires the work. Completely did away with that by taking painting into the realm of social inquiry. So for instance, he was spending a lot of time in, let's say, refugee camps in various parts of the world, and then returning back with ideas and then bringing them into the realm of painting. So in a sense, I think technique-wise, there are certain things here to be said in relation to that. But there was something else that Zainul Abidin spoke about, and he spoke about it not just in terms of interviews, but really kind of practiced it with his students at the art school that he ran, was looking at craft traditions. And in a sense, trying to think about how craft traditions of making, I don't mean tradition as something that is kind of enshrined from the past, just tradition as something that people do on an everyday level, kind of using that to kind of reinstate a newer consciousness, right? And so in a sense, I think the stitching that we do is powerful in that regard. David Medallia used stitching too, very much in the 60s and 70s. And there's a range of other artists whom we can reference right from the early days, right? So I think there is a bigger community of figures that we can track, but they just don't fall along the conventions, I think, that we are used to or taught about in art history schools, so to speak.
But I think they then become like really important coordinates. Like I think, I'm still blown away by, having started working with the estate in 2017. And what's happened in the last 6 years has been, to me, like breathtaking and mind-blowing. But at the same time, like, of course it was like this, because Pacita was the missing link in so many relationships. When you think about Zainul Abidin and Faith Ringgold, when you think about Arturo Luz and Alice Neal, like these people have never converged. But actually Pacita, through her movements, through the way that she makes tangency a virtue, becomes a key figure in trying to make sense of the world and trying to make, I guess, the wider world like a more meaningful place.
Or even Alfonso Osorio, for instance. Another figure.
Yeah, Alfonso Osorio, who, in any other, Alfonso Osorio, I think for people who don't know, was this incredible artist who was working with Jean Dubuffet and Jackson Pollock, but I think because he was a patron and he was the son of like a wealthy sugar owning family in the Philippines, didn't quite fit the kind of working in a Garrett Abex narrative. So it was always kind of made marginal, interesting by virtue of his privilege. And I think about this in terms of, I think one thing that came up in the previous panel was this idea of like being self-taught. And with Pacita, like I remember just before you and Matt came to the archive in, when is this? November 2021, my wife Frances and I were organizing her textiles collection. And we were blown away because she had 400 pieces of like very well preserved, indigenous textiles from various parts of the world. And I think the more that and I think it's so amazing to have this opportunity in the show to see the material culture, the textiles in conversation with the artwork, because those textiles, it was her art school alongside her formal training. It's not diminished by the fact that, that they're not within the kind of usual structure of education. And I think I kept on thinking when we were cataloging her collection, it's as extensive as Seth Sigelab's collection of textiles. And for some reason, that is always read through the rigors of a conceptual practice. But this is domestic. It's exactly the same. And it should be treated with equal weight. Which is why, I think for Pacita, what's amazing is the domestic was always the most radical space to show art. And she was always unapologetic about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, just maybe following up on the domestic, it reminds me of another artist who also actually was in, or showed with Pacita at a time, Amalia Mesa Baines, the Chicana artist who has this great text, Domesticana, where she talks about, we had a wonderful question and comment in the first panel around Pacita's use of borloloy, or this notion of like excess ornamentation, this like fear of leaving white space or blank space. And Amalia too talks about a similar, notion of rasquache or rasquachismo, which is similarly kind of this DIY aesthetic of, putting things together in what we may consider like a slapdash way, but it's a very intentional form of making that is very knowingly kind of critiquing the notion of what good taste is, right? According to like a very Western modernist ideal of, like clean lines and muted tones. That is not Pacita, right? And that is not an artist like Amalia. Like they were very consciously kind of trying to tear down like the very class-based and race-based nature of what, the Western art world was considering good taste.
I mean, I do love the fact that borloloy is now an art historical term. I mean, it gives me great joy to read it on the walls.
That was, I have to say huge thanks to Matt for really pushing borloloy. And we had a wonderful speaker here, Clara Lobregat Balaguer, the designer artist who was part of a design insights lecture where she really unpacks borloloy at the Walker. So borloloy has been at the Walker since, I can't remember, 2018, 2019. But where should we go from here? Yeah. I guess, and the one thing, I do want to say too, and I think Moose does this a lot in your work and kind of crafting these art histories. It's, you mentioned kind of these other artists that she is kind of in community with, even though Pacita didn't know these artists, which is okay, right? Like even if she wasn't consciously aware of artists, I mean, she was, as you said, like very much, inspired by Abedin's and his drawings and his works. But there are artists like, Faith Ringgold, they didn't necessarily know each other until probably later on in their careers. Or, you bring up Osorio, of course, or other artists like Santiago Bose or Noberto Roldan. Like there are other artists who we can think about Pacita in conversation with who they may not have, existed in those circles previously, but there's a certain freedom, I think, that maybe Pacita allows us as curators and art historians to also, think about broadening kind of the practice. So
I just want to go back to our history, because I think what was amazing about that, it was a year-long process of interviewing, I don't even know how many people.
Over 20.
But I think, what was amazing reading it when we finally managed to pare down 100,000 words into 16,000 words was as we were, doing a deep dive into, very, very personal lives, what emerged was like these grand histories, the history of activism in Southeast Asia, Pacita had a classmate in Corcoran, Natalia, who's here, and they lost contact because of during the fall of the Iron Curtain. So these grand events, the earth-shattering moments in world history, become these very, very intimate experiences. And I feel like when you go through the exhibition, you get that sense that it always it keeps on zooming in and then zooming you back out again. And I think that's the magic of the work.
Yeah, so we'll open it up for questions. And while we, wait for some questions to marinate, one thing that I loved that Pio said as we were doing these oral histories is you were saying that your family is, how did you put it, unreliable narrators.
The family motto is never let the truth get in the way of a good story. So there was one, when we were fact-checking the Pacita's biography, there's one entry that stayed for a few years, and it said, Pacita gets kidnapped with Brother June on the way to a Beatles concert. And I called my Uncle June, who's over, and he said, if I get kidnapped on the way to a Beatles concert, I would definitely remember it.
But I think that's, you know, in some ways, again, like maybe
That's the point.
the importance of kind of, you know, inserting like oral history strategies or other strategies into art historical writing, because it's about these contradictory narratives, right? It's not like a something that's completely figured out or a linear narrative in any way. So in the oral history, there are definitely moments of contradiction, which we left in there.
Interesting intersections, right?
Question in the center.
This is for Pio. When you were a young boy, do you remember seeing Pacita painting, or did she have you in her studio and she was talk to you about how she created?
I think after, because, you know, there's an amazing story that, you know, Renzi played a big role in the early trapuntos. And I think Pacita got that and then realized that she not only had an amazing sister, she also had 60 nieces and nephews. And so I have a very clear memory of however many, I think there were like 10 of us. And our jobs, it was a few days before her show at Lou's Gallery. And our job was to, she had the paintings and they were in white frames, which obviously is a no-no. And our jobs was, we were like tracing the patterns of the paintings onto the frames. And we got paid in chicken joy. And it's a really vivid memory because there were loads of paintings and like all of us were just like following the dots. And so I think, yeah, art production and family, you know, it's always heavily, intricately entwined. And I also remember I actually produced my first abstract painting in her DC studio. I don't know where it is now, using her like leftover mirrors and yeah, so I think her studio was always a social space, and the family was, you know, was always welcome in it.
Well, I also wanted to say that I have a good friend who's an art teacher in Greenwich, Connecticut, at a girls' school, and she came to our house and saw one of our Pacita paintings, and was so inspired by it. She wanted to learn all about Pacita. And she did a whole semester with the girls, teaching them how to make a Pacita style painting. And I think Pacita was always a teacher. And I saw a few pictures where she's with the children and everything. I think she was really quite a motivator. Anyway, I just want to say that.
Thank you. My name's Isa, and I have a question that kind of relates to that. I'm feeling so excited for my students who will see this show, and I'm also just feeling really emotional. Like I feel sad for my 18-year-old self in art school for not knowing about Pacita's practice, but I'm curious what you would imagine her saying to students who would encounter her work at this show. What advice she might give them.
Oh, is it for me? Oh, gosh. I think she'd always be, you know, I mean, she loved a huge part. I mean, one of the amazing things about last night was, you know, yes, there was an amazing, you know, after party that Matt had organized. But as you were leaving the museum, there was, you know, tables of people making their own trapuntos. And I think for Pacita, like I think workshops were always part of her practice. You know, she would, whenever she'd have a show in Manila, she would invite all the museum staff for these trapunto workshops from like the director of the museum to the guards. You know, they would engage with her materials, and I think she would be encouraging. She would not just tell people, you know, to keep making. She would facilitate moments where she could physically help people make.
I think also something that I found so fascinating about Pacita was from a very, very early stage in her career, when she had just learned, you know, how to paint, she was really fearless. I mean, her earliest, you know, the painting that's in the National Gallery of Singapore, Flight to Freedom, is a monumental painting. It was made in 1980. Her first, you know, formal art class was in 1976. That's when she first started, you know, learning how to draw still lifes. I mean, we have, you know, in the exhibition, my first still life from 1976, small, you know, work on paper. And then 1980 is a 15-foot long mural that she painted. And so that to me is so inspiring. And you see, we have some photos too of Pacita from her first art shows that she put on in her home and studio. And I think she knew from, you know, very early on that you just had to continuously, as an artist, make. And she was incredibly prolific. She made thousands of artworks, you know, in her 32-year career. But I think she knew that you just had to constantly make and constantly be creative and constantly show your work. And I think for so many artists and artists of color, we know, especially when we look at, you know, art history in the US in the 80s and 90s, and there were so few opportunities for artists to show their work. And for an artist like Pacita, she really wanted to show her work, and we found in the archives huge stacks of rejection letters from museums, including the Walker Art Center and SF MoMA, the two museums where her show will be, you know, is now and will be going, but so many rejection letters. She was really just so persistent in trying to show her work wherever, and when people said no, she found her own venues. But I think that is actually I would think it's very inspiring for artists today, because it's so important to show your work, because also you have to put yourself out there, right? It's a very vulnerable process to put your work out there. But because she was so prolific and persistent, you see the incredible evolution of her practice. And so you see the works that she made, you know, in the 1970s, and then you see the works that she made in the 2000s, and they are remarkable. I mean, her technicality, her skill, her evolution, I mean, how she was handling the paint. I mean, to me, it's you really see the development in her practice. So I hope for, you know, students and artists, you know, who are engaging with the practice. I mean, I think she's.
I mean, she was so adept at orchestrating moments. I think I love that. I think, you know, there are moments in a retrospective sometimes when the last room is always, I don't know, it's when the artist is a bit older and the work maybe isn't as good. But I love that this exhibition ends with her underwater series, because that exhibition, like when you mentioned that show to anyone who saw it, it opened in 86. When you mention it to anyone who even just saw it, their brains would explode, and they would have very, very clear recollections of being there when she emerged in a tank, flippers, and I think also that the way she confounded expectations, you know, that the underwater works in many ways was the most extensive depiction of the Philippines in her body of work. And it was coming at a time when the regime had just fallen or was teetering on the edge of collapse, and the Philippines was in chaos. And it's almost, again, a radical gesture not to depict, you know, the embers of the dictatorship, but to actually like invite people to like take a deep dive and see the country. It was very much like a representation of home and of place, but in a way that no one would have expected, I think.
So we'll just take 2 more questions before we wrap up.
Hello, my name is Jacinta. This is a question for Pio. So I was born in 1998, and I just recently was introduced to Pacita. But when I first saw her, oh my God, I'm getting emotional. I'm sorry. When I first saw all of her work last night, I felt that it really resonated with just a lot of the issues that our youth faces today, especially as Filipino Americans. And growing up here as a Filipino American who really struggled to connect with her parents and her grandparents, Pacita was born right in between my grandparents and parents, and I felt that she spoke so timelessly to today's youth through her work. And I just want to ask, how she was able to do that so well when I can't even speak to my parents or grandparents sometimes about some of these issues that she captures so beautifully in her work about cultural identity, and the streets were paved with gold, but they're really not. I just felt so connected to her yesterday through that. So
I think what makes Pacita so timeless in a way is because she was so heavily invested in her present moment, and I think that allowed the work to, to kind of this sort of zooming in and zooming out of time. Like there was an urgency, looking at there's an artist book that she made that I think Vicky and Matt found in the storage in DC, where she cataloged like a year's worth more of news clippings about immigration in the US. But this commitment to really cataloging her time meant that when you looked at it, it would speak to like whatever time it was,
So we'll take, I think I saw, we have 2 more questions. Okay, so we'll just take 2 more questions here and here.
Thank you. First, I just have to say thank you for your question. Oh my God. Now I need to compose myself. That was an amazing and very brave question. I was really curious actually about, in the last panel, and even to a certain extent this one, we're sort of talking about Pacita's work in the context of American scholarship, or Filipino American or Asian American scholarship. And I was just curious about what the scholarship is of her work in the Philippines, because in my recollection of looking at artists operating in the Philippines, or even outside, but definitely with Filipino roots in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, they were predominantly men that were spotlighted. And I noticed also from the catalog that she was lauded as, what was the award?
10 outstanding young men.
10 outstanding young men. And she was the first, and she was the first woman to get into that category. And so I was just curious about, do you notice a difference in a readiness of scholarship on her work in the Philippines versus in the US? And what is that positionality of interest?
No, thank you for that question. And I'm not sure how to answer that exactly, but you're absolutely right that there has been, quite obviously, a gender imbalance, to say the least, right? But I think as scholarship evolves at 2 levels, I think one at the national level, but I think also at the regional level. My own observation is, in terms of readiness, there are 2 things. The first is that there's an entirely new generation of curators, not necessarily art historians, curators who have entered the field. And a lot like this exhibition, I think there is a distinction that needs to be made here, because just going back to the question of the oral histories, the fact that this catalog features them also highlights that the first draft of a Pacita Abad kind of place in the history of art is being written through the exhibition and not through academic storytelling or history writing in the formal sense. Now, if we go back to the Philippines, I think the moment has been there for the last 5 to 10 years. And I do see quite a bit of new writing coming out from colleagues, not just those who are based like physically in the Philippines, but also, let's say, in Singapore, where I work. We have colleagues from the Philippines. We've always been kind of inherently diverse from the get-go. So I think there are these moments that are in place now, and just kind of tracking the ethnography of Pacita's own arrival, so to speak, has happened in the last 5 to 6 years. So it's actually very rapid if you think about it. I don't know if we fully made sense of this yet. And I think there might be an ethnography required of this ethnography in time to come, so to speak. And that makes it fascinating for me. But I think having said that, there is something to be said here about how, in a sense, so much of our history, at least in the region, had always followed national lines, right? And as a result, I think the nation, as a way of measuring the world, had inherently created these imbalances, because the nation itself may be kind of contented to have a masculine form, which then kind of inherently excludes, I think, not just female artists, but a range of other individuals and communities too. So it's not specific to one group, it excludes everyone else. Could be ethnic minorities, indigenous artists, so on and so forth. I mean, the list is very, very long. And so in a sense, I think the work that needs to be done is extensive. And one place I can say that we do need to start from is by changing the nature of collections themselves. Because for too long, artists from the other communities have never actually been in the collections to begin with, which has not aided exhibition making, it hasn't aided scholarship, it hasn't aided a lot of things. So in a sense, this is the change that is required, not just, I think, at the level of scholarship, but it's a systemic change that needs to happen. It could be a new consciousness that is emerging, I think. And it's not specific to the Philippines. I think it's happening in Indonesia. I mean, I can tell you real examples in Singapore too, which has all this infrastructure, but tends to sometimes struggle, with storytelling in its very sincere form, if there is such a form to be accessed.
I think there's also the peculiarity of Philippine art history, because normally avant-garde movements are activist by nature. And I think in the Philippines, it's complicated by the fact that the site of the avant-garde was the cultural center of the Philippines, which is, the brainchild of she who must not be named. And so there are these, but now I think as there's a new generation of writers and historians, these kind of contradictions, these things not quite fitting in, are now being reassessed. And this is where Pacita, again, becomes like a key coordinate.
One quick point. I mean, if we are to mention scholars like Eileen Ramirez, for example, talks about it as wavered lines, and what does it mean to actually write on a wavered line? Like, is it a sentence, or is it kind of crooked? What is it? Will that sentence still make sense as we understand it, or we expect it to perform? So there are, I think, moments, and maybe it's a process, and we just have to get there, I suppose.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say, just to follow on from both of you, about the kind of the rapidity of this, or the rapid nature of the scholarship, and the very recent nature of the scholarship, and in particular, the scholarship on Pacita. I was talking with Patrick Flores, and he was kind of explaining to me, because I said, well, why isn't there so much scholarship on Pacita in the Philippines? She's so widely recognized as an artist in the Philippines, but she wasn't really taken seriously, I think, for a long time. And of course, there is a very sexist, basis for that. But it's interesting when you look at the critical response to her works in the Philippines when she was showing in the 80s and 90s. She had these very prominent solo shows, but again, they weren't taken seriously. And, the way that Patrick Flores explained it to me, he was saying, well, in the Philippines, there's a really strong history of like art schools, and it's like your tribe is the art school you went to. And so for someone like Pacita, who didn't go to art school in the Philippines, she was seen as an outsider in the Philippines, right? So she was seen as an artist who wasn't really part of the artistic community there to a large extent. And so she wasn't written into the histories there either. So it's really fascinating to think about how, she wasn't necessarily in the art histories in the US, certainly, not much in the Philippines either. And, there wasn't, the histories right now around kind of Southeast Asian art history are being written right now. So I think as Moose is saying, there's so much work, that needs to be done. And we're really just at the starting point for artists like Pacita. So I think we might, end there. So we have a little time for, whoever hasn't been able to go into the galleries to have a chance to walk through. But thank you again for being here with us today. And we are so excited for you to see the show.